to another fabulous edition today of Toronto Business Journal. We have an amazing guest today, Dr. Ponesse, and we'll be talking about the what's going on with the pandemic today and the context of ethics. So take it away, Santosh.
Dr. Julie Ponesse has a PhD in philosophy with areas of specialization in ethics and ancient philosophy. She has a master's in philosophy with collaborative specialization in bioethics from the University of Toronto and a diploma in ethics from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. Dr. Ponesse has published in the areas of ancient philosophy, ethical theory, and applied ethics, and has taught at universities in Canada and the U.S. for over 20 years. In the fall of 2021, however, Dr. Ponesse saw her academic career of 20 years fall apart after she refused to comply with a Canadian university's COVID vaccine mandate. In response, Dr. Ponesse recorded a special video directed to her first-year ethics students. That video went viral. Since the release of that video, Dr. Ponesse has joined the Democracy Fund as the pandemic ethics scholar, focusing on educating the public on civil liberties. My Choice, the ethical case against COVID-19 vaccine mandates. In December 2021, Dr. Ponesse released a book published by the Democracy Fund titled My Choice, the ethical case against COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Thank you so much, Dr. Julie Ponesse, for joining our show.
Of course. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ponesse. A special welcome. And we definitely want to talk about your book, My Choice, the ethical case against COVID-19 vaccine mandates. But before we get to that, one thing I wanted to talk about is for us to step back a bit and to talk about, your tremendous expertise in ethics. And, all of us have a different concept of what ethics is about a little bit. And since, ethics, I wanted to get you on the program because ethics is something very important to me. And I have a certain understanding of ethics, so I was hoping that based upon maybe a little intro on my understanding, you might be able to critique that so that we can get more of a common grounding on ethics and how, it relates to the pandemic, because there's been some extremely bizarre criticisms of you on supposedly ethical grounds. So my concept of ethics comes from the idea I have of, as humans, we are mind, body, and soul. The soul as humans connects us, our spiritual interconnectedness is about empathy. And to me, empathy is the most important human characteristics. And ethics, to me, is the intellectual system that we humans have to rationalize, from my perspective, our sense of empathies. For example, the idea that you see somebody walking across the street and you're a driver, you don't run them over, that's ethical. And there's also an extension, our sort of sense of human empathy, and all the systems that we do in place are rationalizations of how our survival and our sense of how we live together in a way which is, decent as decent human beings. So how would that relate to what would be a more sort of grounded perspective from your academic background, Dr. Ponesse?
Yeah, there's so many things that can be said about this. One of the things that occurs to me that's so interesting about what you say about empathy is that in order to empathize with another person, you have to understand, or at least try to imagine, what it's like to be that other person. So you're connecting with something other than yourself. And I think that if we think about that for a minute, it reveals an awful lot about where we're failing these days and how we are specifically failing when we other people. You hear this language a lot, right? Stigmatizing and discriminating against and shaming and bullying. These are all sorts of othering approaches, right? Because what we're doing there is we're saying, you out there, you are different from me. You are distinct from me. And I'm going to set myself apart from you. And there's a double standard now in terms of value. So I can treat myself and people like me and people who are part of my group in one way. And because I've identified you as being different in kind, I am now allowed to, I have legitimacy to treat you with different value and usually worse. So I think that that notion of empathy is deeply connected to our ability to see the other person as not entirely different from who we are, to see the humanity in another person, and to understand that they are deserving of the same treatment that we are deserving of. And then to step back from that a little bit, just to give people, I think one of the common threads among all moral concepts is that when we're asking moral questions, we're asking questions that come in the form of ought or should, as opposed to is or factual questions, right? We're not asking about data. We're not asking about the length of things, the amount of things, when something happened, what a drug is made of, how many people were injured in a particular situation. That's relevant, but those are is questions. They're questions about fact, right? When we're talking about morality, we're pulling back from those facts and asking whether or not what we're doing is the right thing. Should we do this? Ought we be doing this? Are there ways that we can act better? Right? So it's a normative discipline in that respect. It's a discipline to do with value, and we're asking questions about how we, as in my view, right, we're asking questions about how we as human beings can do the best we can with our actions and can become the best people possible given the constraints in which we find ourselves. And I think you're very right to point out that being empathetic is one of the, we might call them character traits of a person who is trying to be the best version of a person possible.
Yeah, with that said, I mean, thank you very much for clarifying that, Dr. Ponesse. One of the things, definitely when I've been seeing your presentation at the Democracy Fund, and it's very articulate, passionate about, the type of craziness going on where we're sort of having to supposedly ignore all the human tragedy that's taking place, control over our own body, as if corporations and big government and big business, they should just put anything in our bodies. And one of the things which I was looking at a particular Toronto Star article, which was sort of criticizing you on ethical ground, is that it sort of reminded me of George Orwell's 1984, particularly when they talk about doublethink and newspeak, and that it's like they are trying to construct a sort of a new language system of so-called ethics, which has nothing to do with ethics, what I would call reinventing language to reflect the ideological and social control agenda of totalitarian society. And just in case many of our audience doesn't know what doublethink is, I know you will know, Dr. Ponesse, but a process of indoctrination whereby the subject is expected to simultaneously accept two mutually contradictory beliefs as correct, often in contravention of one's own memories or sense of reality. Doublethink is related to but differs from hypocrisy. And then it goes on in the Wikipedia citation to refer to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which cancel out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy. And then it goes on to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory, and again at the moment it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again, and above all to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety, consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then to once again become unconscious of the act of hypnosis performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. So I'm so sorry for that long quotation, but I thought that this is the kind of mind which is saying, oh, how could Dr. Ponesse talk about ethics when and it's like they're ignoring the fact that we, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they're ignoring all the stuff you talk about in terms of fundamental ethics. They're ignoring all the casualties of adverse reactions, of people dying, of mortality, in this idea that we as individuals should submit ourselves blindly to some construct of control as good, and that we should not think of, the rights, empathy, morality, ethics, just that our duty is to surrender to this construct. So
And
what
become
you
like
might have
robots.
comments on that.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think what you're getting at is a very complex issue. And we're at the point now where there's such a chasm between people on the, we'll call them the narrative defending side and then the counter narrative side of this pandemic response, that there's such a big gap between those people that even the most, I think, charitable, intelligent, thoughtful representatives of each of those groups can't help but think of people on the other side as being crazy and evil, because we can't, it's beyond comprehension to each group how
Like
the
a
other
divide. Yeah.
What's that?
It's like a clear divide. Yeah.
A clear divide, but it's so beyond comprehension to us how the other side could have arrived at the views that they arrive at. And you say that, well, there's people feel that we should be under control and that we shouldn't care about things like empathy and informed consent and all of that, but I'm not sure that's quite what's going on, right? I think that it might be the case that people on both sides agree that empathy is important, or they agree that kindness or helping others or being safe, or there's some of these common values that we think are important, but we have fundamental disagreements about how we arrive at those things or how we best promote those things. And you mentioned control. People on the narrative side, you hear this over and over again that, we should care for other people. We should do our part. How do we know we're doing our part? How do we know how to care for other people? Well, we listen to our public health officials. And it became pretty clear months ago, I think, that this debate between the pro and anti-narrative side of things was not about evidence, because we're just seeing evidence being thrown back and forth across, the wall, and it's not having an impact. It's not being taken up by either side very successfully. And you wonder, well, why is that? And so many very intelligent, thoughtful people have been commenting on the psychology of this. We've heard the term mass psychosis, most recently from Robert Malone, but it's been discussed by a number of people, I think quite rightly so recently. Mass hysteria is I think a version of that psychosis. So mass hysteria would be sort of a species of that broader idea that there's a detachment from what's ultimately real, and that's fueled by your membership in a group. So, I think people, there are probably some truly terrible people in the world right now, but the vast majority of us, if we're failing, are guilty of not so much calculated evil as we are guilty of, misdirection or misguidance, and thinking that we're doing the right thing all the while causing some great harms in the process. You mentioned, vaccine adverse events, and the part of the narrative is that there are no such things. That the greatest adverse event that happens with these vaccines are mild, temporary, allergic reactions at the site of injection or something like that. Those on the counter narrative side say that we have an unprecedented number of very serious adverse events, including death. We just saw that there's a 40% increase among young people that was released from the Indiana insurance report just this last week. VAERS reports are up, in unprecedented numbers. We have an innumerable cases in Ontario alone of young people who have died, and I won't say due to the vaccines, but post-vaccination. And that's very, these are people without pre-existing health conditions. These are not people with terminal illnesses who happen also to pass away. But I think that kind of evidence is something, it's a non-starter in this debate, because people on the who are defending the narrative, I don't know if they say, well, I don't believe you when you say that there are serious adverse events, or they're negligible and just sort of the cost of doing pharmaceutical business in the public health context. I'm not quite sure. There's probably people who hold these different views, but we are in a state of, I think, a very serious kind of cognitive dissonance. You talk about that double speak, right? Where you are in the position of being asked to believe, and then in a Stockholm syndrome kind of way, you come to believe two things that are really inconsistent or irreconcilable with one another. And that creates a tremendous, weight, to put it mildly, and break in some cases in our minds, and we don't know how to deal with this. I think we don't know how to work our ways out of this, because we've been dealing with this for 2 months. The government keeps telling us that they know what to do, they know how to fix it, just follow their orders. Most people, the vast majority of people, are following their orders, and we're worse off than we were 6 months ago. That fact is either not believed by people defending the narrative, or they believe it, but still have some reason to think that they should follow this particular narrative that they've been following all along. And I think our really interesting questions are, why is that? Why is it, if we're good historians and we look back to the past, why is it so hard for us to believe that our government could be getting this wrong? Why can we not even entertain that as a possibility in our minds? Is it because what else would we have to come to terms with if that was true? Our whole belief about the world and what keeps us safe is no longer true.
It's
a pretty
basically
scary
fear of the unknown, like what comes after this, right? Like if the government is lying to us, then who is saying the truth? So
are they lying
easy.
to us? Are they have they made a mistake, and they're just on a very grand scale with very significant effects, and now are kind of scrambling to cover their bases? Is it a mistake, but they're not quite aware of the mistake, and it's just become so internalized that they're just kind of acting automatically on reflex and just kind of following the patterns that they've established? Is it some combination of these things? I'm not sure, really. But I think, to put it colloquially, the proof is in the pudding, and what we're doing is not working. And the fact that we have, who knows what kind of percentage, we probably have something like a solid 10% growing into the 20-25% range of people who are starting to think this is all just a little bit weird. But that's not the majority of Canadians.
So, Dr. Ponesse, I wanted to congratulate you on your book, My Choice. I noticed on Amazon it was #1 on health policy, and probably other categories as well. Wanted to congratulate you on that. So did you have a question, Santosh, about My Choice, Dr. Ponesse's book? I also wanted to see if you could maybe talk a little bit about your experience of writing the book, My Choice, in terms of it being an introspective or difficult experience, kind of revealing yourself in that book. Wanted to get your sort of insights on that. And Dr. Santosh, please free to ask a question as well.
Oh, sure. I just also wanted to make it clear, to the audience as well, you have nothing against vaccines in the past, and but you just have the issue of them, being forced to take one, and so there's a distinct difference. So don't you agree?
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to make clear is that we don't even have to get into the territory of whether or not taking one of the COVID vaccines or taking another kind of vaccine is a good medical choice or not. I think what we need to do is focus on the difference between two things, and that is that choosing to take a COVID vaccine for yourself is a medical choice. Choosing to impose a mandate on someone else, support the government measures that infringe on other people's lives, use your vaccine passport that's a result of that personal medical choice, those are all political choices.
Yes.
Right? And so my concerns are when we start using our own medical choices that give us certain privileges as leverage in society to create a sort of tiered system, according to which certain people have certain privileges and access to public spaces and access to non-essential services and possibly in the near future access to essential services. When we use that privilege to give ourselves an advantage that I don't think we're entitled to, that's when we really start getting into the category of unjustified moral harms and I think political harms, because I think what we're doing, we're seeing this kind of stratified society. This cannot but there's no way that this is not going to affect our democracy. And, I think about this a lot, and the state of our country, the state of democracy in Canada, whether our citizens feel happy and flourishing and free and bonded to one another. And I don't think we have any of those things. You might think, that going through a health crisis of some kind would bring people closer together. That might be the case, often in families or in close personal relationships. When you go through something traumatic, I know of a couple who lost a child just after Christmas a year ago, and against all odds, all statistics, that brought their relationship to a much deeper level. And this happens sometimes. You might expect that in our society, going through something traumatic would further entrench our civic virtues and our connection to one another. And though, the Health Canada's ad slogan is "we're all in this together" and all of that stuff, I don't think that's the reality of it. People say it all the time, but I think we feel more alienated and more miserable and more afraid of one another than ever.
That's true.
So I know you have to go soon, Dr. Ponesse. So is there any sort of insight or that you may wanted to share with us today that you might not have had a chance to share at other interviews, or related to any recent developments or concerns that you have about what's going on, or maybe a pearl of wisdom from your book? Just wanted to leave that opportunity for you.
It's a tough question. I think a lot these days about, when I was writing the book, it sort of started out as a treatise on to explain why the vaccine mandates are ethically unjustified. And that really ended up becoming only one chapter. And I found it much more interesting in some sense to talk about how we got to where we are and how we can move out of this place into the future. And I think in order to do that, in order to move beyond something traumatic, we really need a sense of hope, don't we? We need to feel that it's possible for the world to be other than it currently is. It's possible for our country, our lives, our children's lives, citizenship to be better than it currently is. We need to imagine that we have a leader and not a bully in our prime office in Ottawa. We need to imagine a time when that's possible. You look at some of the darkest times in human history with some of the worst leaders, and most of those countries, most of those people came out of that. And if only in the moment they could have if only they could have looked into the future to see that it was possible to imagine another kind of life. And that's what hope is about, isn't it? And I guess I just encourage people to try to find hope where you can and to hold on to it where it's possible. And even, I said earlier that vaccination is a medical choice. Using that to create division in society is a political choice. So I would encourage you, if you kind of feel torn between those two decisions, if you want to get vaccinated for COVID because you feel it's the best medical choice for you, then by all means do that. But please think about the consequences of using that pass to go out for dinner. Think about your agency as an economic entity and what you do with your money and the businesses that you support with your money, because that in some sense has the greatest effect in society. And I would just encourage, I don't want to tell you what to do, but I would just encourage you to think reflectively about these things before doing them, and not just outsource your thinking about them to our government or our media or anybody else.
Fantastic. Awesome. So on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Ponesse, for taking the time to share, come to us today, share your insights and perspectives, and we're grateful for that. And we hope that you will continue to go stronger and stronger in helping be one of the leaders, the spiritual leaders that will help bring us out of this time of darkness that we're having into the light, where we can put this type of dystopia that seems to be before us behind us, hopefully. So thank you very much for coming and joining us on Toronto Business Journal today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ponesse.
Thank you.
Awesome.